Hello, everybody. Oh, you shut the door. Okay. Cool. I'm going to host us this evening, so be gentle with me because it's my first time doing this. So I may call upon you two, or just like throw something at me if I start doing things wrong or getting it all in a muddle. What's that? Sorry. That's okay. Something soft. Piece of pizza. That'll do. Okay. This evening we have got two talks. One from Callum and one from Kirsty. Where's Kirsty? Oh, there. But first of all, so we've got the two talks. Then we're going to take a break, and we'll have the open discussion and a raffle after the break. For those of you who might not know, the open discussion, there's a board out there, out in the room out there. When we have a break, go and put any thoughts, any questions, anything that you want to discuss on the board on a post-it note, and have a look at the ones that are out there, and if there's something of interest to you, then put a tally mark on it, and when we come back in after the break, we will go through those questions in order of the number of tallies, and we'll have 3 minutes on each question to have an open discussion, and if anyone wants to continue, then put your hands up, and we will carry on if there's enough people want to keep talking about that subject until the time is up, or we get to the end of all the questions. Before we begin, we'd like to say a huge thank you to our awesome sponsors. So first of all, can we have a round of applause for Code Weavers, and Kanuka Digital, Data FlexNet, and Vessels Value. Thank you all very much. So without further ado, Callum is up to tell us all about how to find a boss who swears.
Right, that's not the right thing. That is though. Finding a boss that swears. So the first thing everyone probably thinks is, what does it mean? It's more of a metaphor for actually finding the right company for you. In my experience, it's been a case of the boss that actually swears has been a much better environment. They kind of set the tone for the company than it has been for one that doesn't. So how do we actually go about finding the right company for you? So there's a few caveats that I want to say to this. The first is it's pretty volatile, things are likely to change. It depends on whether it's what kind of market is like. It's also kind of industry specific, so this is focused more at the tech industry. If you go into a different industry, some of these points might not hold up. I also think it's kind of generational. The way that I approached an interview like this, I think, is kind of more around the millennial kind of generation that I am. I think old generations have thought differently in the past, and I'm sure a newer generation will think differently again. And it's also subjective. So what you think, how you approach it is going to be different to the way I do, and that's perfectly fine. So who am I? I'm a 26-year-old software engineer. I work at Bluetel Solutions based in Birmingham. And I've got about 4 years of development experience, and I've got a few years of graphic design experience before that as well. So about 7 to 8 years so far. So what are the steps to actually finding a new job that has the right company for you? So the first step, and probably the most important step, is actually find out why we want to leave. This obviously goes for if you actually have a job at the moment. So if you're still looking, or you're just a graduate, then obviously this is going to be quite an easy list for you. But finding out why you want to leave means that you can work out what you need to fix when going to a new company. It also you might find out that actually you don't need to move companies at all. There might be a different role that you like within the same company. So it's really handy to have this list set out before you do anything else. So I actually recently went through this process a few months ago. So why did I leave? Few things that I looked for mainly, there were a few other issues, but these were the big three, was a bigger team, bigger projects, and newer technologies. So whilst it was just me and the developer at my old job, and I get on with him really well, he's a good friend, having a bigger team, what I wanted to do was be able to actually grow a bit more, be able to kind of take experience from other developers who had different expertises to me, different kind of specialisms that I could kind of pick up on, but also give back to them. I've got a certain set of knowledge that I can give to that team. I also kind of wanted to work on bigger projects. So the work at the old place was kind of much more fast-paced, shorter projects, and whilst they were really fun to work on, it left me kind of feeling like I was doing the same things over and over again, or there would be a good idea and a really fun project to work on, but I didn't get the time to actually take it from being a good idea and a good project into something that was really fantastic. So that's something I also wanted to focus on, that I could kind of get my teeth into. And lastly is newer technologies. So if you're working with a framework that you kind of maybe don't find as fun as some others, or you're working with a language that you might not prefer, it can take its toll on you. If you're working 35 hours, 40 hours a week just on this language or on this platform, it's a lot to commit to. So working on newer technologies or on preferred technologies means that you're kind of more excited, more engaged to learn more and grow as a developer. And it also means that when you get home and you have personal projects that you want to work on, you're much more motivated to actually work on those. Because why would you work on a personal project in a language that you don't like? So now that we know why we might want to leave, we need to kind of work out what we actually want to find. So again, this is going to be quite individual. So this is the kind of things that I looked for. So we've got the top 3, bigger team, projects and technologies, which we've just run through. But there are some others there as well. We want to make sure that we don't just change one problem for another, and we want to kind of make sure that we can tick as many boxes as we can when we're trying to find the right company. So the rest of those were a good team environment, and this is really important for me. Part of a bigger team is also having that good and fun environment. Jobs where people can do things in the evening together is really good as well. And actually, the place where I'm at now, Bluetel, one of the things that sold me was their culture that they have with their team. There is no I in team. If a mistake goes to production, it's never that one person's fault. That code, that bug that went in, whilst it might have been written by one person, it should have been code reviewed, IET'd, tested, the multiple steps before it should have gone to production. So if there's a mistake, it's the team's fault. It's the team's responsibility to fix that and to deliver a good product. You also want to go for the right salary. So it's always good to get paid for your expertise and your knowledge, as it definitely has a value. So making sure that we get the right salary is obviously important. Another item is commutable. Do you want to walk to work every day, 5 minutes down the road, or are you happy to commute all the way down to London 2 hours every day? So having an idea of how much you want to commute is obviously a really good idea. And also to work in a preferred industry. I have industries that I would prefer not to work in, and I've actually had that. I spoke to a recruiter, and it was an industry I didn't want to work in, and she said, sorry, it's not right for me. So it's really important that you actually know what those are. And it's also important to know your priorities. Which of those are the most important, and how much do you want to actually compromise on each of those items? It's good to have an upper and a lower limit for how much you want to hold them onto. So, for example, you might have a minimum salary that you're willing to accept, and that might be what you're currently on. But you also might go, well, actually, I think I'm worth this much. So let's set an upper limit of whatever figure that might be. Same goes for commuting. You might have an upper limit for how far you actually want to commute. For me, that's around about an hour. And actually worked out that if I had gone any less, I wouldn't be working at where I'm at now, because we're based in Birmingham. It takes me about an hour to get there. So had it been half an hour, I would have not even applied for the job. Third, before we can actually kind of start to even applying, we need to work out actually how much you're worth. For mid-level engineers and senior engineers, this is fairly easy to step. Most of the time you've got a good idea of kind of where your value lies. But for juniors and for graduates, this can be a lot harder. So how do we work out how much we're worth? So you have to be true to yourself. You have to deflate your ego. There's no point going for a salary twice what you're currently on if you can't do the job, because all you'll do is, if you were to get hired, it'd be very clear quite quickly that you can't do the job. And all that means is you're back in the job market again. So you want to make sure you don't shoot too high, but you also want to make sure you don't undersell yourself. Your skills have a value that you deserve to be paid for that knowledge and that expertise. So it's important not to let things like imposter syndrome get the better of you and just take an easier job because you'd be less nervous that you'd be able to get it. So you want to push yourself a little bit to always progress in your career, but don't go too far, because all you'll do is just give yourself extra stress and be back in the job market. So how we can actually find that figure can be things like looking at applications. So most job applications these days on job boards and things like that have a salary range. They will be from X to Y amount. And does that salary range, when you look at it, can you look at what's required of you, and can you do 80, 90% or even all of what they're asking you to do? And most of the time they will say minimum of X years experience as well. So you can kind of get an idea of, if I have this much experience, how much should I be kind of paid for? And we can also look at salary surveys. Salary surveys are a bit kind of taking them with a pinch of salt. You don't really know the underlying reasons of why a figure might be that much, but you can kind of get a good idea, but make them relevant. If you're not looking for a job in London, don't go looking at London salaries. So next we actually need to apply for jobs. So we can do this through a couple of ways. We can do it in an active way and a passive way. So active are things like job boards and actually just Googling companies. That can be a great way to find new employment as well. And then passively are things like LinkedIn. So if you set up a LinkedIn account and you can start connecting with people, then recruiters have a chance to actually find you. What I would say is, don't expect a recruiter to come and find you 2 days after you've signed up. It takes a bit of time, and you definitely shouldn't just rely on that method for trying to find a new job alone. It's also important to try and look for red flags when you're actually looking at application. Does it have too much lingo in there? Is it just all kind of enticing text, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about the company and who they are? Do they ask for a graduate role, but then they want 3 years of experience? And do they list every single language under the sun that you need to know to be able to apply for this? These are all kind of red flags that they don't really know what they want. And you need to make sure that you kind of prepare for that if you do end up applying for it. So recruiters, love them or hate them, you're going to have to deal with them. About 75% of the job postings, I'd say, were through a recruiter that I applied for, so you're going to have to speak to them. So I want to give a bit of advice for both individuals and employers on how you can make it easier for both sides to actually find each other. So for individuals, the first is to take the time to speak to them. They don't work with just one organisation, they might work with multiple, so speaking to them means that whilst you apply for one and they give you a ring, actually you can apply for other roles that you may not have seen on any job board or anything like that. And it's also important to get the information you need for them. They are the contact for this organisation, and at this point you probably don't even know who that organisation is yet. So finding out as much as you can about the organisation and what their culture is like and things like that, what the work is actually a really good way to filter out companies who you actually want to even go for an interview with, if you actually want to send your application from the recruiter to the organisation. And then for organisations, understand that they are the face of the business. Whoever you employ to recruit to find a job, if they do a bad job at speaking to an applicant, that applicant will be put off ever wanting to actually apply for that role. So making sure that they can do a good job and actually represent the company properly is really important. There's a typical thing of making sure they understand the role. If they can't filter out applicants properly because they don't know the difference between the cliched Java and JavaScript, how can you be sure that they're actually doing what you pay them? So it might be that working with them closer can help you actually get a recruiter who can actually pass on the right information and look for the right person as well. And it's also important to kind of review their applications. I think there's a step in job applications, which is the first is to obviously deliver the information that you need. What kind of skills are you looking for in a person? But there's a second step, which is how do you get that applicant who you have no idea about, how do you get them excited about applying for your company before over all the other adverts that are out there? So look at the application and go, does this have enough information to make an applicant go, yes, I want to apply for this company? So once we've actually applied, there's the interview step that at some point you will get to. Doesn't matter whether you just put one application in or 100, you will find an interview. So there's a typical kind of advice that I'll skim over, be smart, be punctual, and do the research on the company before you have any interview. But I'm just going to run through kind of two types of interviews which I think are helpful with some tips. So the first is technical interviews, and the second are kind of what I call a personality interview, where it's more face-to-face, although it can be over the phone as well. So first is technical interviews. So there's mixed feelings on this. There's a lot of that stemmed from the Silicon Valley giants and how they've interviewed people before with large numbers of applicants. And this tweet from Max Howell, the creator of Homebrew, couldn't get a job at Google because he couldn't invert a binary tree, despite having created a software that 90% of the engineers at Google had used. So if you hold too much weight onto technical interview, you can lose some really, really good engineers. So don't fight it, it's going to happen. It's filtered down from those giants into the UK. And there's only a few ways to go about it, is practice. Go on LeetCode, go on HackerRank. They're a great way to practice, and you can see how fast your algorithms are actually running. And it's also, if you approach it from a different mindset, it can really change the way that you look at them. Instead of just seeing it as a blocker to an interview of how to get a job, if you like doing crosswords or Sudokus in the back of a newspaper on your commute, try doing a challenge in one of these practice sites, because they're actually really fun to work on when you see it as a brain teaser, as opposed to just a thing that I have to know but never use. And it's also important to say no to large take-home tasks. It should be a couple of hours max. If somebody gives you a week worth of work, say no, it's too much. Your time is worth more than to do free work for them. Or if they do give you a big project, then get paid for it. Because, like I said, you might be applying for lots of jobs. If you did a week of take-home tests for every one, you'd have no time left. So, personal interviews. So this is a big one where you can really find out about the company. And this could be over the phone or face-to-face. But the interview goes both ways. It's not just them interviewing you, you interview them. You find out what you need to about the company if you haven't done already. And it's also a chance to ask the questions that you couldn't do before. So obviously make sure you do research on the company, find out what they do. They might even have a bit about how they work, or even a lot more on their type of career. So make sure you do that research, and also have a prepared list of questions. Things like the type of work. Is it agile or is it waterfall? How many hours are you going to work, 35 or 40? It's really easy to miss that question because it's not put on the job application. You don't know until you get the contract. Ask what their kind of review process is. How do you get reviewed, and is that performance and financial review, or is it just one or the other? Is it every 6 months? Is it every 3 months? It's good to know, because it gives you a measure of the company. You can ask about things like the equipment that you're going to be working on. If you're okay with working on any platform, then it's great. But if you only work on Mac, then if you go to a company with Windows, there's a learning curve that you have to approach. And it's also good to ask to meet the team and the offices. A lot of tech companies have really, really good equipment and facilities that entice you to work for them. Things like PlayStations in the break room, or I've even seen chefs in some of the companies, or free meals during certain days of the week. So it's really important that you actually go around and see the office, see where you're going to be working. I think it's something that some employers will try and skip over. So once you've got an offer, then it's important that you take the time to think about it. So spend the evening, sleep on it, and then make your decision. Don't take too long. Companies will, if you don't want the job, somebody else will. They will have interviewed other people, so don't take too long. But take your time as well. And in my opinion, this is definitely a subjective thing, don't ever accept an offer if you get one in the interview. Always take the time to step back, think about it. If you've got partners, speak to them. The rubber duck technique is fantastic even for making decisions. They will give you a salary as well, so there may be some haggling that you have to do over this. And it's important that even if they give you an offer, if it's not what you're looking for, if the salary is too low and it detracts too much from the role, it's still not too late to say no. And don't be afraid to say no as well. So a quick recap. So why are you leaving? What are you looking for? What salary are you looking for as well? Make sure you actually send in the applications. Take the time to speak to the recruiters. Prepare for the interview. And then once you've got the offer, take the time to think about it. So that's hopefully some steps of how you can actually find a job with the right company, not rush into anything, make sure you know what you're looking for, and hopefully somebody will find it useful. So I don't know if there's time for questions now. If not, we can do it later. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions. It's either a good sign or a really bad sign. No questions? All right.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you very much.
Of course, bear in mind, if you do think of any questions, then stick them on the board in the break, and we can put them to Callum after the break. But next up, we're going to invite Kirsty Burgoyne, who's going to come up and tell us all about CSS Grid.
Cool, thank you. Right, sorry about all the faffing around. So today I'm going to take you on an excellent adventure through CSS Grid. I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff you can do with it. Hopefully avoid some of the gotchas that could potentially make it a bogus journey as well. So about me, this is me. As you can tell, my special talent is taking selfies. It's quite remarkable knack. So I work at Human Made. I'm mostly a WordPress developer, but I specialise in front-end development. I do occasionally write about stuff and talk about stuff, but both are things I'm going to try and do a lot more of this year, so hopefully you might see me again at some point talking about something else. Do come and find me later. I'm at Kirsty Burgoyne on everything, so it makes it nice and easy. So there's something you should know about me, and that is that I really love layout. I love all of CSS, but layout is what excites me the most. I also really love naff 80s films like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But this is a bit of a warning in that this is pretty much where the link to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure in relation to CSS Grid ends. When I wrote the synopsis for this, I was actually taking a wild stab in the dark at WordCamp US, and so wrote something completely outrageous in the hopes that it would put me above other CSS Grid talks. When I came to actually write it, I realised it's impossible to tie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure in with CSS Grid. They just don't correlate at all. There's no relationship at all. And the only reason that I really wanted to do it was so that I could use this GIF. So there is a lot of code in these slides. These slides are already on my website, and I've also created a code pen as well that's got all the examples in. So if you don't have time to look at all of the links in this, then you can go and have a look around later. So let's start by getting to know all of you a bit. So who here builds websites? Cool, most of you. Who's been building websites for more than 5 years? Cool, that's more than I expected. Okay, so most of you might remember this. I'm going to take you back to a time before CSS Grid. It was genuinely a horrible, horrible place. It was where layouts went to die. In the beginning, we had table layouts with the most amount of markup, and we had to rely on spacer GIFs to move things around. It was horrific. And then we made it all so much worse by introducing frames, where we would then dump all our table layouts and just make it awful. But there was light at the end of the tunnel, and that was CSS. For me, this enlightenment came from this book, which when I was doing my research, I hadn't realised I was published in 2007, so that means I've been doing this quite a while. It's scary. But this taught me about CSS and creating semantic and accessible markup with far less code. And for me, it was just a total game changer. From there was things like CSS Zen Garden that taught you how you can change the entire look of your site without ever having to change markup just with the CSS. It was great. Since then, more features have been added to CSS. Browsers have moved on, and eventually even support for IE6 died. Now we have CSS3, and that's introduced a load of new cool things, especially in the world of layout, and those include Flexbox and also Grid. So I'm not going to talk about Flexbox because it's awesome in its own right, deserved its own talk another day. What I'm going to do is show you some CSS Grid and how to create really flexible and scalable layouts. So let's start with what CSS Grid is. For me, Grid is the future. When I was writing this, I was going to say Grid is the word, but then I realised that's the wrong film and also the wrong decade. So Grid is the future. So what is a grid? MDN tells us that it's an intersecting set of horizontal and vertical lines, one set defining columns and the other rows. Elements can be placed onto the grid within these columns and row lines, which pretty much sums up what grid is. These intersecting lines is what create a two-dimensional grid system, which makes it the first true layout method in CSS. The other layout methods are what I like to call fake, and they're one-dimensional because they only deal with columns or rows, whereas CSS Grid allows you to control both at the same time. It gives us the ability to present content in a way we've just never had before. So let's start by creating an implicit grid. So if we take this container of 5 items, it's pretty straightforward, and then apply display grid to it, and also in this case a grid gap, just so it's easier to see. Now you'll automatically get a grid, which is pretty neat. This is what we call an implicit grid. We haven't defined any columns or rows at this point, so the content defines them automatically for us. In this example, it's defined it as 1 column and 5 rows. If we look at the grid tracks created, we can see the horizontal and vertical track lines that intersect to create the grid. But this would be a really boring talk if that was all I was going to do with grid. Although it's pretty cool, implicit grids don't really give us that much control over the layout. In most scenarios, we are going to need to have more controlled than that, set number of columns, set number of rows, things like that. And that's what we call an explicit grid. So if we go back to the original grid container, but this time, ooh, that's interesting. Does it come back?
You're back.
Cool. Okay. Just don't breathe on it. Yeah. So this time you can see we've got grid template columns in there, and we've defined 150 pixels twice, which basically tells the grid we want 2 columns that are 150 pixels wide. Both grid template columns and grid template rows tell us essentially what the grid should look like. Each column and row can have an explicit value. In this example, we've set 2 columns and allowed the grid rows to autoplace. You can also add grid template rows. So here I've just said, right, we want 3 rows. One is 50 pixels tall, one is 100 pixels tall, and the other is also 50 pixels. Grid rows can be especially useful when you're designing components that are independent of a page. It gives you quite a lot of flexibility. So another really useful trick is we can also name the track lines. The track lines are the horizontal and vertical lines that intersect. It's important to note they're not the columns or rows themselves, because that can become very confusing if you get that. So here you can see we've got body start, the column middle, and body end have been named. So as well as that, in the CSS specification, we've also got a number of units and functions that are pretty cool as well, which I'm just going to run through quickly. So the FR unit basically stands for fraction. It is really super cool. It allows you to size your grid columns or rows according to the proportion of available space in the grid container, which is really super useful. So if we go back to the earlier example where we set 2 columns at 150 pixels each, in our original grid, the grid area was actually wider than what you can now see here. And that's because we've set a fixed value on the columns, which is taking up less space than the entire grid area. So if we wanted these to be 2 equal columns, we could change the 150 to 50% each. And that would give us 2 equal columns, but it would also create horizontal scroll bars underneath, which are not nice. And the reason for that is because of this grid gap of 10 pixels here. So as you can see, 50% and 10 pixels and 50% does not add up to 100%. It adds up to a very sad emoji. So we could get around this by doing some crazy calculations to subtract gutter width and things like that. But as soon as you start dealing with a grid with 16 columns or 22 columns or whatever, that becomes insane and completely unmanageable. Or you can just use the FR unit. So here, now we've got grid template columns. Each column has a width of 1 FR. And what that's doing is it's looking at the grid template area, going, okay, there's 10 pixels of grid gap here that is not available. So we will distribute around what's left of the available space. So it automatically subtracts your grid gutter and works it all out nicely for you with no fancy sums or anything, which is really cool. Repeat is a small function. If you do any kind of programming, probably familiar with this. Literally, instead of writing 1 FR twice, just put repeat. Again, if you're working with grids that are like 16, 21, 30 columns, you did one that was 44 columns once, that's very scary. It makes the repeat function just makes it so much easier. Here we've used repeat twice for the columns, and just for kicks I've also added in the rows. So you've got 3 rows at 50 pixels high as well. So min-max is the last thing I'm going to go through, just of an overview of grid. Min-max is what really allows us to create flexible, dynamic grids, but still have the right amount of control over them. So in a nutshell, it's you can set a minimum value and a maximum value for each column or row you're applying this to. So this example, we've now gone with 4 columns. 3 of them are just 1 FR, so they will expand to take the equal amount of space available. But the 3rd column will do the same, until it gets down to 150 pixels wide, in which case it will stop collapsing and fix itself at 150 pixels, which is quite nice, and we'll give you something a bit like that. So you can see all the other columns collapse down, but that one fixes at 150 pixels, which can give you some pretty cool effects. We could also take it a step further and set min-max for all of them if we wanted. So that's some of the essentials of CSS Grid. There is literally a mountain's worth of stuff that I've not included in this talk because I assume you all want to go home at some point tonight. But hopefully this has covered everything of the examples I'm about to show you of some of the cool stuff you can actually do with Grid. If you are interested in some reading, I have many more slides with these sorts of links. So, but like I said, my slides are on my website. And there's a list of all the reading materials if you do want to read it. Right. So in this section, I'm going to go through 3 different ways to use CSS Grid, which is truly awesome. Each has its own place and may not be perfect for every scenario, but hopefully it shows the potential of what you can actually do with Grid and think about your different approaches to layout to the traditional methods that we normally use. So this first example is the no breakpoints approach. So I work pretty much exclusively with WordPress sites at the moment. And even when they're not blogs, they nearly always have like a recommended reading section, latest posts, new products, or something similar, which will look a bit like that. So before Grid, I would have done this with Flexbox and used breakpoints to control how many posts are on each row. Before that, probably would have set them to display block and floated them all. And probably before that, would have just cried and not bothered. And you can achieve this very easily with breakpoints, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's still an established pattern. But what if we don't need breakpoints? We could do this with Grid without the need to add breakpoints in as well. And it's one line. So here we have the Grid template columns. We're using the repeat function and also the min-max function. The difference here is the value of autofill for repeat. So all it's doing is saying, right, well, we want X amount of columns, but we want them to be a minimum width of 200. Otherwise, we want them to fill the available space. And what the autofill does is, as your container changes width, it will look and see, okay, well, have I got space for another column of 200? No? Okay, I'll just make the ones that are there expand and fill the space. If yes, then it will put another one on the correct row. So you'll get something very similar to this. So you see it drop down to 2 and 1 and back up again, just by doing the autofill, which I think is pretty cool. But this isn't particularly new. So autofill, Rachel Andrew wrote about this in April 2016. But I will say that I never really gave it much time until I happened to see this article much more recently, which was like, oh yeah, can't believe I never thought of that. So and now at work I'm like, we've got to use this approach. So it's pretty cool. So there you go. There's my first excuse for the excellent GIF that I think is valid. Right, so the next example is, I can't remember, what is it? Oh, the no wrapper approach. So this time you're looking at flexible gutters. So normally when you wrap content on a page, you do it something like this. You just have like a wrapper container, set maximum width on it, center it, which is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's still, again, it's still a very valid way of doing things. But with Grid, we can have some fun and control the entirety of the page without that wrapper container. So this is the code this time, which looks a little bit more involved. But what this is doing is creating a 3-column grid for a content area. So if you see the middle line, repeat 3. And then another column on each side that creates the site gutters. In this example, what I've done is I've also named certain grid tracks to define the start and end points for the 3 key areas of the page. So here you can see we've got body start and container start defines the outer grid column. We've got 3 columns in the middle, which would be our content area, and then another on the end there. This will give us a page layout technique that controls how our content is sized and how page gutters behave without needing any media queries again. So this is an example, so you can see the outer columns collapse down, using min-max again, they collapse down to 10 pixels, which is around about the sort of gutter you would expect on either side of content on mobile. Obviously you can change that. And the main content area changes accordingly as well. So if we go back to the code, we can see that the middle column is actually 3 columns, as we saw before, and it's set to a min-max of 0 and 300. So the 300 is what's creating your content container. So you've got 3 columns, so that's 900 and 2 grid gaps. If you wanted like a bigger content area, you'd maybe make that 400 or something. And it's that maximum width that's controlling the content of the page. Another useful thing about naming grid tracks is it helps us explicitly place content within our grid as well. So here, what I've done is I've said, right, well, I want the 2 outer columns to any content in those I want to start in the clearly defined grid areas, and everything else can span just 1 column and it will work, which is pretty cool. I mean, yeah. So why do this? You could do it for a number of reasons. I find actually setting an entire grid across your entire page. So quite often I end up working on websites that have advertising banners that have to be placed outside of your content, and you get weird if you try and position them absolutely or try and fit them in any other way. They kind of jump around and do things you didn't want them to. Or again, going back to the WordPress stuff, with the new Gutenberg editor, you've now got, they give you the option to select content to be full screen, wide, or the width of your content, which if you've set your whole page as a grid, makes that really easy rather than trying to have to use negative margins to break out of the content, stuff like that. If you didn't want content in the gutters, we can target our columns slightly differently. So here I've just used the numbers of the grid tracks rather than naming all of them individually. This does introduce media queries again, but media queries are not a bad thing. That's not the purpose of this talk. It's just how much you can do with much less code. So yeah, I think that's another excellent example. Another good use of the GIF. So, and the last example I was going to show you is using CSS variables to superpower your grid. Now, I don't use CSS variables anywhere near as much as I should, but they are really cool. Again, like the Flexbox stuff, they're a whole talk on their own, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into what they are, other than the main difference is between them and Sass variables is once your CSS is compiled, a Sass variable, the value is hard-coded, it's not going to change. The CSS variable is dynamic and will change dependent on the conditions of how the website is being displayed. So as a general rule, it's a good idea not to try and mix the two unless you really know what's going on. So if we were to give the grid some superpowers, the first thing we can do is change how many columns are in the grid. So here I've set up a CSS variable of column count even, which on mobile has 6 columns and on desktop has 12. This is quite nice and handy if you have a designer that insists on working in a 12-column grid and dropping it down to 6 and not allowing content to flow, because then you can match what they're trying to achieve much more easily. Then in our grid template columns, you can see now we've added the variable for column count. So it's just, we've kept the breakpoint actually out of the CSS controlling the grid. It's like a degree of separation, which I always find nice. We could take it further and then also set the column width and the grid gap as well. I'm aware that 6 columns of 200 pixels is obviously way too wide for a mobile device before anybody points it out, but it's good, it gives you the general idea. So that's how you can easily apply them. And again, it just keeps things nice and tidy, and it's all dynamic as well, which is pretty cool. If you notice on this one, so all of these variables have been scoped to the grid container, which means if you try and use these variables outside of that, then they won't work, which is quite cool. So you could also scope different variables to the grid items. So if you wanted to place things explicitly, as I showed earlier with the wrapper container, you can actually just set yourself up with some variables for that, which would look like that. So in here with this one, it said, right, on mobile, I want my grid items to span 3 columns, and we want them to always look like they're in 1 column, so they span. So you've set all your positions, and then on desktop, they span 1 column, and you explicitly position them, which you can just. So on the right-hand side is the CSS that would be in your normal file, which I think is much neater than doing that. And what's on the left-hand side, like I like to keep it in a completely separate file, just because it keeps it neater and nicer. The CSS variables thing, that's really scratching the surface. It's some very basic examples. I don't use them as much as you could do, but they are really cool, and hopefully you can at least see the potential there as grid becomes much more, basically as it becomes an older technology, more people adopt it, you'll see more and more people pick these sorts of things up. So here's some more resources if you want some more light reading. And so on to the bogus journey. So hopefully, if you're all still awake, then you at least get the idea of what you can do with grid. It's pretty cool. But it's not perfect. There are gotchas. And the first one is content ordering. So content ordering is not new. It is something that was introduced with Flexbox. And it's really cool, but it should be used with extreme caution. What you can do with it is rearrange the visual order of content. So here we've selected the 3rd grid item, so I made it pink. And then by changing the actual order, we can make it display as if it's the 5th grid item, which is super cool, and there is some advantages and genuine reasons to do that. The problem with it, though, is it doesn't change the actual source order, the HTML. It only changes it visually on the page, which means anybody that's trying to use screen reader or navigate through the site using keyboard will get some very unexpected results, because the tabbing order and everything will follow the HTML and not what's actually on the screen. That can be extremely frustrating and is not good at all for accessibility. But like I said, there is sometimes some uses for it. So, yeah, that's right. So, and the other one as well is Internet Explorer. It is the elephant in the room. Every time we talk about new technology in any depth, we always have to mention it. I don't have to support Internet Explorer 10 anymore, but sadly I do still have to support IE 11. But it's not actually as difficult as it seems. So Rachel Andrew wrote this article about should I try using it back in 2016, and she gave us this great table of properties of the IE specification and what the current CSS grid one is, and it's still valid now. And I refer to it quite often. But what you find is you get used to the same issues time and again. And the biggest one is actually about prefixing. I mean, if you do any CSS at all and you've got any kind of compiler, you've probably got auto prefixer in there somewhere to help with different backwards compatibility. But prefixing won't actually work in this case, because the IE implementation isn't as simple as putting -ms at the beginning of it. It's got a few other things you have to do. So a couple of examples is, so now instead of just having display grid, grid template columns and grid template rows, I've now had to put an MS grid in there and MS grid columns and also MS grid rows. And you'll also notice that I don't use the repeat function for the Internet Explorer stuff because repeat is also not supported. And there is also the other major pain point of Internet Explorer is that auto placement doesn't work either, so you do have to explicitly place all your content. So where I showed things about naming track lines and positioning things on track lines, it's quite a good idea to just get in the habit of that anyway, because you're going to have to do it again for IE otherwise, and quite often will look a bit like that. That's a lot of extra code, but to be honest, depending on what your grid needs to be, you'll see that like the nth child increments and the grid row and column position increment in different ways. A little bit of maths you can normally do, like a mixing to get around that for Internet Explorer. If you do look at the code pane collection, I've put a couple in there that I've used on projects, just so that you can see that it's not actually as horrific as it looks. I have realised that I didn't put and the most important thing about Internet Explorer that I've nearly missed is whenever you write anything to do with Internet Explorer in CSS, the only way it works is if you put sad face, trash can, fire in your style sheet as well. It's just the only way. So there's some more reading if you would like it. All of these links, like there's tons of stuff on the internet now, all of these links are directly related to things I've shown on here. So like you can have a read through of some of that stuff or go and browse. But hopefully I have taken you on a bit of an excellent adventure, given you a glimpse of the future of layout. I think CSS Grid really is going to be the thing everybody does soon, because it really makes us change the way we think about flexible design and layouts. Like especially the idea of not having to use breakpoints for everything. We're not constrained to specific requirements anymore. Content can flow based on the amount of space available. And that's really what responsive web design is all about. Thank you for listening, and be excellent to each other. See anything I could tie in?
We've got time for one or maybe two
One question.
questions. If anyone has got a question. Any questions?
I could ask two questions, mini questions. Right, first of all it looked to me as if you always code, you start with the mobile view first and then work out, rather than start with the desktop and work in. Is
Yes.
that the usual thing now with most coders? Is it?
Yeah, I would say so. I do, because it's just, you build from the simplest view and add the complexity as you bring the screen out. So it's just much simpler to work from that way. Otherwise, what you end up doing is building really complex pages and then like having to take things out as you bring it back down to mobile. So yeah, usually mobile first.
And I also presume that you use Flexbox in conjunction with CS Grid. You use Flexbox with
Yes.
CS Grid.
Yeah, I mean, there's a load of stuff out there on the differences. Lots of people think that Flexbox is now on the way out because Grid can do everything, but that's not true. So what I find with layout stuff specifically is if you've got to work in a way where you have to add specific measurements, then Flexbox is usually better for that, because with Grid they have the FR unit and things, so it can be much more fluid.
We've got one more question up here from Martin.
Yeah, what's the adoption of CSS variables like across browsers now?
As far as I'm aware, all modern browsers support it, only Internet Explorer 11. Same as always. Yeah, so an Internet Explorer 11 does have some support for it, but like you end up having to write fallbacks and all sorts that makes you wish you hadn't bothered. But
Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much, Kirsty. Really appreciate that. So we'll take a break now and come back for 20 past. Does that sound good? 20 past. Cool. Don't forget to go and put questions on the board and vote on anyone else's questions if you haven't got any yourself.